Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be officiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as I try to do every year this will be my 7th year in the United States Senate, if time permits, sometimes our work here finishes in a different fashion, but if possible, I try to come on the last day of the legislative year and give a speech kind of recapping the year behind us and outlining the challenges of the year ahead. And for me, it was obviously an eventful year and a productive one, and I believe it's been one for this chamber as well, in what is a unique political environment in which politics today is practiced and covered in ways that we've never seen before, almost like entertainment. But nevertheless, it was a year that we got a lot of good things done, and I wanted to highlight some of them. And in the hopes that that gives us momentum into the new year. Anytime it's my first experience at a new president, and obviously not just a new president, but a new administration that brought with it a set of individuals in different positions. So I would think for all of us was a transition in that regard. It also was the beginning of a second term that at one time I didn't know I was even going to pursue. And in arriving here early this year and getting to work, we slowly but surely got going on a number of key priorities that we have been working on for a very long time. The first one that happened was the VA accountability bill. And this was a bill that I had been working on for a number of years, and it basically gave the Secretary and the VA the power to fire people at the VA that are not doing a good job. It's that simple. There's no anything more complicated than that. Made it easier to fire people that were not doing a good job. They'd still have due process to defend themselves. And there was a lot of objection to that proposal for the better part of 3 years in the previous administration and some of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle. But then everything lined up this year. And Senator Tester and Senator Isaacson, who were the ranking member and the chairman of that committee, came on board and really helped push this and moved it forward. And it passed in both chambers and was signed into law by the president. And this was a substantial achievement. What's interesting about it is that because it was bipartisan and because there was cooperation and because no one was fighting with anyone on it, it didn't get a lot of press coverage. But it happened, and people need to know about it. Does it make the VA perfect? No. Are there still challenges to be confronted? Absolutely. But this is something that has to do with accountability and the ability to get rid of people that were not doing a good job. And it was something that for years could not get done because somebody always objected and found a way to stop it. And then it came together, people working across the aisle to make it happen. Today it's the law. And today there are people that were not doing a good job that are no longer employed at the VA, thanks to it. And that's an important thing that people need to know. And I always remind everybody, the overwhelming majority of people that work at the VA are doing a good job. It's the ones that are not that we need to replace. The year went on, I had an opportunity to interface and interact with the National Security Council and with the White House on 2 foreign policy issues that didn't really require legislation, but that I am grateful and excited about having the opportunity to help craft. The first was a new direction on U.S. policy towards Cuba. The previous administration had basically changed our policies towards Cuba, opened it up to much fanfare and, quite frankly, a lot of editorial board excitement. It was the enlightened position, apparently, to argue that doing more trade with Cuba was going to somehow help Cuba transition to a democracy. But after 2.5 years, it's become apparent that that change has done nothing other than flow more dollars into the hands of that regime and help them in their efforts to normalize. And so when President Trump was elected, one of the things he wanted to talk about was what we needed to do to change that relationship back to something that favored the Cuban people and not the Cuban regime. And those changes came about, and they were announced earlier this year in an event in South Florida. And to cut to the chase, what it does is this. It says that people can still travel to Cuba. Americans can still go to Cuba as part of a group or as part of an individual going on behalf to support the Cuban people. But if you go to Cuba, whether off a cruise ship, an airplane, or there in support for the Cuban people, you have to spend your money at places that are owned by Cubans, by everyday Cuban people, not by the Cuban military, which is trying to create a monopoly. For the first time in the history of that tyranny, there is a U.S. policy that places individuals in Cuba, private individuals in Cuba, in a favored position in comparison to the military and the Castro government. And I believe that that law will slowly but surely pay dividends. as it becomes abundantly clear to the small, independent, private sector in Cuba that the reason why they aren't growing and the reason why they aren't attracting more customers has nothing to do with U.S. policy. It is because their own government does not want to allow them to be able to grow their businesses. And the Cuban government feels threatened by private business. That's why, number one, because they're communists, and number two, because they don't want people in Cuba to be able to support themselves. They want people dependent upon them. That's how they control politically. And so we'll see what decision the Cuban government makes in the months and years to come. But here's what's abundantly clear. There are people and Americans who, under our law, can travel to Cuba, can spend money in Cuba, and they'll have to stay at an Airbnb or in a private home, or even, if the Cuban government allows it, a hotel that's owned by a private entity. Where they cannot is in places controlled by the Cuban military or by companies controlled by the Cuban military. The second foreign policy issue that we were able to get involved in is another tragedy in our hemisphere, and that's what's happening in Venezuela. To cut to the chase, you have a tyrant. The tyrant is afraid that he won't get reelected. He lost control of their National Assembly, which is their legislative body. His name is Nicolás Maduro. And so what does he do? He basically figures out a way to create an alternative Congress called the Constituent Assembly, basically modeled after the fraudulent Cuban Constituent Assembly-like model. What it basically does is it guarantees that certain sectors in society have seats of representation. Instead of seats in Congress by a district or a state, they're represented by different sectors, labor, electricians, you name it. But here's the funny part about it. The only people that can run for it are the people they allow to run for it. And they also get to count the votes. Well, as you can imagine, that fraudulent Constituent Assembly basically votes 100% in favor of whatever he wants, literally with very little dissent. It's not democratically elected. Meanwhile, the legitimate democratically elected Congress, for lack of, to use terms that we would use here, has basically been intimidated and stripped from its power. Maduro doesn't allow them to be paid anymore. They don't have staff anymore. So all sorts of things of that nature. And so we encourage the President of the United States to pursue first individual sanctions, to grow the list of individuals in Venezuela that are sanctioned and no longer able to benefit from ill-found gains here in the United States, but ultimately also to continue and prevent them from doing something they've been doing for far too long. And that is they are stealing the oil of Venezuela. They are selling it in global markets at a discount, and then they use, to use rough numbers, they'll take $1 million worth of oil, sell it for $500,000. They'll take some of that $500,000 and use it to pay the interest on the debt they already owe, and then the rest of that cash, they use it for themselves, and they sprinkle a little bit of it to some of the elites around them just to keep them loyal to the regime. In essence, those mid-level or higher-level military officials who decide, well, things aren't great in Venezuela, but at least my family is better off than everybody else because we're loyal to the regime. And the president moved to stop that. Today, U.S. entities can no longer trade with in these fraudulent, in these illegal bonds that are stealing from the people of Venezuela. And it's a tragic situation. This is not an embargo. This is not economic warfare the way Maduro calls it. This basically is preventing them from continuing to steal. And I would add one more point to this. I encourage everyone, if you can, last weekend the New York Times ran an article, pretty extensive series, on starvation. Children literally starving to death in Venezuela. The richest country in the hemisphere, the richest country in South America in terms of one of the most oil-rich countries in the world, a nation with a long history of stable economics and even the longest democratic tradition in South America. And there are children starving of images that you normally associate with other continents at other times in our history. Children starving to death in Venezuela. Meanwhile, Nicolás Maduro looks like he weighs more than he ever has before. And all the people that surround him in his government are heavier, fatter than they've ever been before. And children are starving because of them. Not because of U.S. policy, not because of sanctions. There is no one in the world other than his handful of cronies that would argue that it has anything to do with any sanctions. It's because of them. Because in addition to being incompetent, they're criminals. They're criminals. The Venezuelan government, from the top down and everywhere in between, is filled with narco-traffickers, with people that allow narco-traffickers from Mexico and from Colombia to fly and use airports in Venezuela to traffic drugs. So just imagine for a moment, in this country, if our elected officials said to certain drug dealers, if you pay us Not only will the DEA not stop you from trafficking drugs, but they'll help you move it. That's what happens in Venezuela. Imagine for a moment if the Department of Defense went to drug dealers and say, if you pay us, not only will we allow your planes to fly, we'll tell you what time to take off and we'll escort you when you're in our airspace. That's Venezuela. State-sponsored narco-trafficking at every level. And by the way, they offer another service. If you don't pay them, they tell you, don't worry, we'll arrest your rival drug dealer, but we'll protect the ones that pay us. And they are some very wealthy people in that government. In addition to corruption and stealing from the people of Venezuela, they're narco-traffickers. The vice president of Venezuela is a narco-trafficker sanctioned by the United States as a drug kingpin. And it just goes on from there. The vice president of the party who controls their intelligence services, a thug by the name of Diosdado Cabello, is a drug trafficker. The nephews of the president of Venezuela, the nephews of his wife, the first lady, were just convicted and sentenced last week in a court in New York for drug trafficking. And by the way, in their testimony, it's all filled of evidence. I hope in the new year that we can find a way to continue to support the brave people of Venezuela and a better way forward. And you would hope, by the way, that even in the Venezuelan government, even in that fraudulent constituent assembly, you would hope that there are people there that liked Hugo Chavez and believed in the stuff he believed in, but have to see that this thing is a disaster, that this incompetent man is destroying that country and starving their children, that there's no future in the direction that they're headed. And we hope that this situation improves in the years to come. Senator Cardin was on the floor yesterday discussing this, and I want to reiterate it. I hope next year early we can move on a bill that we've introduced together called the Venezuelan Humanitarian Assistance and Defense of Democratic Governance of 2017. This helps address a lot. It puts in place a plan to help with this humanitarian crisis. You'd need a government that allows us to do it, but knowing that the United States, working with Canada and Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Spain, and the European Union, knowing that there are these countries ready to step in and help, might be an incentive for decent people still left in that government to step forward and begin a process of transition. It was an interesting year, and one more legislative thing that we took on, and that's the Race for Children. It's a pediatric cancer initiative. There are not enough innovations in pediatric cancer when you compare it to adult cancer. And this law requires pharmaceuticals to begin testing adult drugs on pediatric populations so that hopefully we can develop more pediatric medicines. I worked on that with Senator Bennett of Colorado. We got it passed, signed into law. Again, not something that got a lot of attention because it was bipartisan and not controversial, but it's important. We're proud of it. Good work that we put on this year on that regard. We had hurricanes that impacted Florida not once but twice. First, Hurricane Irma, and then Hurricane Maria that struck Puerto Rico and had an impact on Florida as well, as approximately 200,000 U.S. citizens from Puerto Rico have moved to Florida because there's no electricity, because the island had already been hit previously and because it's facing a financial disaster, and now it got hit by the storm. And we were very involved in helping there, in particular working with Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez, who's a true and a dedicated public servant to the people of Puerto Rico. Number one, in getting the right response. It took a little too long for the response to get going, but it finally started moving. But there's still so much to be done. The estimates are it'll be another 8 months before power is restored. And a disaster like that is never good news. But for the first time, at least in 7 years, I feel like my colleagues know more about Puerto Rico than ever before. They understand the challenges it faces because of its unique status. They understand the pre-existing challenges it faced before the storm, and they understand what lies ahead. This is not, there was a time, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but there was a time when people sometimes would talk to me about Puerto Rico as if it was a foreign country. We had to remind them these are U.S. citizens. On a per capita basis, they volunteer to serve in the armed forces as much or more than anyone else in the United States. And so I hope that in the year to come, we'll redouble our efforts, particularly on disaster relief, to ensure that Puerto Rico doesn't just recover, but is rebuilt stronger than ever, so we don't have to continue to revisit this in the future when the inevitable happens, and that is that they'll face a storm again because of their presence in the tropics. And of course, just a few days ago, we passed tax reform. It's Not everybody likes it, but I think more people will as they start to see its true implications. By March of this year, the overwhelming majority of Americans are going to notice that their paycheck is bigger than it was a year ago. And if you didn't get a raise, it will be solely based on tax reform. If I were king for a day, the law would look a little different, but we don't have kings in America. We have a constitutional republic in which making things better is our goal. And sometimes if you get 70 or 80% of what you want, that's certainly a victory. Sometimes if you get 50% of what you want, that's a victory. Most change in America happens incrementally through our constitutional republic. Every now and then we can take major steps forward. And here's the bottom line. America's tax code today is better than it was before this bill passed. Do I think we went a little too far in the direction of multinational corporations? Perhaps. Not that it's going to hurt the economy, but I thought some of that could have been geared towards working families through a further expansion of the child tax credit. But overall, I do believe it'll help grow our economy, and more importantly, I do believe it will leave more money in the hands of Americans to be able to spend it for their families. It's their money, it's not ours. The best way to look at it is, if I came here and said I wanted to spend $2 trillion over the next 10 years of borrowed money to give it to the government so the government could stimulate the economy, there'd be a lot of support from the other side of the aisle and from the press. They'd call it genius and enlightened of the Republican to think that way. But if we say we want to leave $1.5 to $2 trillion in the hands of the American people in the private sector so they can stimulate the economy instead, it's a disaster and it's irresponsible. So it's just a philosophical difference of opinion. There is a role for government, and we must fund it. We have to rebuild our military. We talked about disaster relief. There are important things for government to do. But by and large, a dollar spent by the private sector or by an individual family is going to generate more growth than a dollar spent by the government. We fund government not to grow the economy, but to help sustain it and protect it and keep us safe in the food that we eat and the airplanes we travel on, and certainly from threats, foreign and domestic. But economic growth is the function of the private sector and of individuals. And tax reform helps to achieve it. That alone won't be enough. One of the singular challenges in America today that we must confront in the new year, hopefully, is the skills gap. It's not just a throwaway phrase. It's the fact that the best paying jobs, the ones that actually pay you enough to raise a family and save for retirement, those jobs require skills that our schools aren't teaching. Those jobs require skills that millions of Americans do not have. And we've got to change that. We've got to make it easier, not just to graduate people at 18 years of age ready to work. We've got to make it easier for people at 45 to be able to go back to some sort of school and acquire the skills they need for a better paying job. That will lead to economic growth. That will help fill the 2 to 3 million unfilled jobs that we cannot find people in this country to fill with the right skills. That's how you get people raises apart from economic growth. And I hope the new year provides an opportunity for that. I would add that in addition to that, the new year will provide us an opportunity to focus on infrastructure, which is critical. My state of Florida is particularly impacted by not just storms, but sea level rise in coastal areas. And there are things we can do to mitigate against it. We need to restore the Everglades. And of course, we need roads and bridges and to improve our infrastructure and airports. And hopefully we can confront that as we work on infrastructure. 2018 will be a year that will deal with a farm bill. And I hope that action will be taken to reform crop insurance to ensure that my state's farmers are never in the position they've been put in after Hurricane Irma, with neither a reliable safety net nor a reliable commitment from the federal government to step in when federal programs fail to meet disaster needs. Next year would be a water resources year, a water bill year. And again, it's an opportunity for us to do critical things for our infrastructure. In Florida, beach renourishment, intercoastal navigation projects are important, not just to our way of life, but to our tourism industry. So too is harbor dredging projects with the expansion of the Panama Canal. So it's important that these things get done next year. They won't get as much controversy or fanfare, but these are critical things that we can do. Another opportunity next year that we've heard some talk about is the ability to reform the social safety net. On that front, I would say that's an issue that I've pushed for a very long time. But sometimes when you talk about reform, people think you're coming at it because you want to cut. For me, it's not so much about cutting. It's about improving the way we deliver the same services. How can we use the money we are already spending in the safety net, but in a better way? These programs, I believe in the safety net. I actually don't believe free enterprise works unless we have one. People are not going to take risk. People are not going to strive if they think that if they fall, the consequences are economic devastation. You have to have a safety net to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves, the permanently disabled, the elderly, and the alike. But you also have to have a safety net for people that have come upon tough times until they can get back on their feet and try again. But I fear, in fact, I've realized long ago that our safety net programs treat the symptoms of poverty, but they do not cure it. And that's why I hope if and when we tackle the social safety net, and I hope we will in 2018, it will not be so much about cutting as it will be about reorganizing and improving. Yes, we will take care of people in their emergent needs, in their immediate needs, but we will also make it easier for you to go back to school and get a degree or a technical certification so you can find a job and never again rely on the government. And in fact, if we do that for enough people, it will save us money because less people will be on the social safety net. But that should not be the reason why we tackle it, not as a cost-saving exercise, but as a way to lift up more Americans. Because we are in a global competition, and our chief geopolitical competitor in the economic space in the 21st century will be China. China has over 3 times as many people as we do, and we have to compete against them. They have 1 billion, we have 380 million, 400 million people. We're competing against an economy with 3 times as many people. We need everybody. We are not a nation that can afford economically to leave anyone behind, and we are a nation that leaving anyone behind would be a betrayal of our founding principles. And that's what I hope we will tackle next year if we tackle the social safety net with job training programs. In a few moments, the Senate will hopefully take up and vote on. I know everyone's anxious to return to their states or homes for the holiday. A continuing resolution. I'll say that I'm disappointed that we're leaving here at the end of this year not having taken on a disaster relief bill that I know the people in Florida and Texas and the wildfires out west, Puerto Rico, need. I believe that we will confront it. I believe that we're going to do that in the early part of next year, along with a permanent extension of the Children's Health Insurance Program and other matters. Next year, we'll bring an opportunity as well to deal with things like immigration security, the opportunity to deal with young people brought to this country through no fault of their own by their parents who now find themselves here illegally in the country. And there's I believe, a real chance next year to make progress on providing them certainty and the ability to stay in this country for the future. All these things are there, and they'll happen in the early part of this year, but at least when it comes to disaster relief, it's disappointing that we won't be able to do that here, largely for legislative strategic reasons, not for policy ones. But I'm confident that we will deal with it in the early part of next year. And I actually think 2018, despite it being an election year, if we allow the momentum that closed out this year to carry over to the new one, that we're going to have a chance to continue to do good things for our country. And in the end, given our differences that exist in this country today, it's hard to imagine we will ever always agree that every idea is a good one. But I hope we can all agree that our job here is to make things better. And sometimes making things better means 1 step forward, and sometimes it means 50 steps forward. But as long as we're moving forward in a pattern of perpetual improvement, I think we should be proud of the work we're doing. And I think by and large in 2017, despite the fits and starts, despite the controversy, despite the headlines every morning about the outrage of the day or questions in the afternoon that usually began with, how did you feel about the tweet on this or on that? Despite all those distractions, I think 2017 will go down as a year of consequential improvement, where things happened in this chamber and in this city that made America better, not worse. And on that, I hope we can continue to work. And so I thank you. I wish all the people of Florida, all of my colleagues, all the people of this great country and around the world a happy Hanukkah, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. Look forward to working together to make things better in the year to come. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.